Olá, este é o Poder Entrevista, eu sou Paulo Silva Pinto, editor sênior do Poder360. Vou entrevistar Duncan Depledge, professor de geopolítica e segurança da Universidade de Loughborough, no Reino Unido. Duncan Depledge tem 38 anos, é historiador pela Universidade de Sheffield, mestre em teoria política também pela Universidade de Sheffield, mestre em geografia pela Universidade de Cambridge e doutor em geopolítica pela Universidade de Londres. Foi diretor no Parlamento Britânico do Grupo Interpartidário para Regiões Polares. Participará em 16 de novembro de 2023 do webinário Mudanças Climáticas e Defesa Nacional, organizado pela Escola Superior de Defesa do Brasil. Professor Duncan Depledge, obrigado por esta entrevista.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Agradeço também a todos os web espectadores que assistem a este programa. Esta entrevista está sendo gravada por videoconferência no estúdio do Poder360 em Brasília, em 13 de novembro de 2023. Para ficar sempre bem informado, inscreva-se no canal do Poder360, ative as notificações e não perca nenhuma informação relevante. Eu começo essa entrevista perguntando: em que medida o aquecimento global muda a guerra?
So there's three ways that we can think about the relationship between climate change and war, and the most common way of thinking about it at the moment is to speculate on whether climate change could be a driver of conflict and war in the future. So how might the effects of climate change on rising sea levels, on food security, on migration, how could those things become drivers of conflict? Another way that we've started to think about climate change and warfare is as weather and environments become more unpredictable and more volatile and reach more extremes of heat and rainfall and so on. Those more volatile environments will make it harder for militaries to operate. So it may be, for instance, that it becomes too hot to operate certain kinds of equipment, or it may be too wet to move certain equipment and so on. So in those circumstances, we would have to think about how climate change will force armed forces to actually adapt the way in which they operate to cope with more extreme conditions. But the third way that we don't talk enough about is that climate change will also drive a global energy transition. It's already driving a global energy transition. And as the world moves away from fossil fuels, militaries are going to have to think about their own transition. How are they going to fuel themselves in the future? How are they going to operate in a low carbon world?
Como as estratégias de defesa em diferentes países devem mudar?
The real challenge for defense across the world is, first of all, to understand what their contribution is to climate change. How much are they actually emitting of various greenhouse gases? How does the way in which defense operate actually contribute to the problems that, in some respects, are rebounding on defense through the kinds of insecurity that I talked about earlier? Beyond that, defense will need to think very, very hard about how it can potentially reduce its emissions. How can it decarbonize? And there might be 3 or 4 different ways that it could do that. The first of those is to think about, well, are there alternative fuels that are available, low carbon or low carbon forms of fuel? We talk about the defossilization of fuels. So rather than relying on oil, coal and gas taken out of the ground, those fossil fuels, can we create synthetic versions of them? Or could we use biofuels? Nuclear is something that some militaries have been very familiar with, but it's also about renewable energy, battery storage. But if those kinds of technologies don't work, or if they don't arrive and mature fast enough, it may be that other kinds of changes could be adopted by militaries, certain kinds of behavioral changes in the ways in which they operate. We actually have to ask our militaries to only focus on the things that are really core to the military. So we think about territorial defense from existential threats.
Os países já estão atentos a essas preocupações?
I would say that the awareness levels are growing. I think Western militaries, in particular, if we think of the NATO countries, are starting to acknowledge that this is a challenge. NATO 2 years ago made it clear that they wanted to be the lead organization dealing with the security implications of climate change. They wanted to be able to understand these challenges and also drive the response. And that obviously has an alliance-wide consensus, although we could debate how much within the alliance, how far along this journey different countries are. Certainly a country like the UK, France, the United States, Canada to some extent, some of the Nordic countries are all talking a lot more about these kinds of challenges. They don't have the answers yet, but they recognize the challenge. Outside of the West, we can look at India, we can look at China as countries who have also made noises or certainly written down in certain places. They've acknowledged that this challenge exists, that there is a need to move to alternative sources of fuel, noting that if you can't move your militaries away from these things, some of those climate change targets are going to become harder to address. So I would say that across the world, there's a growing acknowledgement that this is an issue, that this is something that militaries can no longer ignore, but the extent to which they're able to come up with solutions and alternatives is still very much in its infancy.
As mudanças não serão imediatas. Quando os países devem começar a se preparar para isso?
Well, it's interesting how you pose that question, because on one level, I think you're completely right. It's not a problem that's going to be solved this year or next year. The issue, though, is that because it takes so long to procure military equipment, I mean, we're talking about projects that could take 10, 20 years to actually come into existence, in which case we're arriving very, very close to 2050. So I would say if you're procuring military equipment in the next 5 to 10 years and expecting it to remain in service for the next 30, 40, 50 years, this is today's problem. It's not something that you can wait until 10 years' time to try to come up with an answer to.
Então, quem não estiver pensando nisso está atrasado.
Yes, exactly. Because those countries that don't start to innovate now will very much be forced to adapt in the future. And as we know, adaptation is usually a lot more expensive.
Forças Armadas deveriam ter metas de mitigação de mudanças climáticas?
So this is a really difficult question at the moment, because there are certainly some groups, some environmental groups, who are pushing very hard, for instance, to include military emissions in the national the national contributions to the UNFCCC process. So when countries are filing their inventories of their carbon emissions, at the moment they don't have to include military emissions, and there's a push that they should. And this is kind of, I suppose, part of a broader move to say that countries should be legislating to say that their militaries need to have emissions targets. The problem is you can set those targets, but at the moment we still don't know how big the problem is. The estimates of military emissions globally range between about 3% and 7% of total global emission. And focusing on whether militaries should be emitting is perhaps not the main focus of, is perhaps not the main problem here. The way I would put it is that this is not necessarily about forcing militaries to reduce their emissions for environmental reasons, although there's obviously very, very good reasons to do that. The challenge for militaries is actually the future availability of fossil fuels in a low carbon world. So as the world moves away from fossil fuels, it will become increasingly more expensive and increasingly risky for militaries to remain tethered to those fossil fuels. So we can talk about putting in policies in place saying that militaries must decarbonize, and maybe we should be doing that, and there's lots of good reasons for doing that. But the problem, as I see it, is that irrespective of whether militaries are told to do this, they will still have to confront it. Otherwise, it's going to be very, very expensive to sustain militaries using oil, gas and coal when the rest of the world has moved on.
A defesa é ligada à soberania do país. Não estaria excetuada de obrigações na mitigação do aquecimento global?
So that's pretty much the standard view at the moment, and I think that's been the assumption in most countries up to now, is that militaries are broadly exempt from this. That if you are going to have an emissions policy, you're probably not going to start with your military. You're going to focus on your industry, you're going to focus on your civilian sector. I think that also reflects the fact that in most countries, militaries are a relatively small emitter. I mean, if you tackle military emissions, you're still going to have a huge problem on your hands in terms of overall country. The issue is that as countries address those other areas, as those emissions start to fall, and as they move away from fossil fuels, it will become increasingly expensive to sustain a military based on fossil fuels.
É possível prever quando as Forças Armadas em diferentes países deixarão de usar combustíveis fósseis?
Not yet, no. I think that would be a very difficult thing to try to forecast at the moment, because so many countries, those countries that are going after this are still, as I said earlier, trying to understand the nature of the problem. They need to get the systems in place to actually be able to measure their emissions and understand their emissions before they can start to drive down those emissions. But that's, again, another reason to be investing now in understanding what the military's exposure is to this problem.
O senhor tem uma avaliação de como a área de defesa do Brasil deve se adaptar às mudanças climáticas?
I don't have an assessment yet. This is precisely the work that we are trying to do through this seminar series that we are embarking on this week, where we are bringing together defense leaders, academics, and hopefully also some industry stakeholders from the defense industry to actually talk through some of these challenges and try to understand how this would apply specifically in the Brazilian context.
Algo que deixou de ser perguntado aqui, o que o senhor gostaria de comentar?
Going back to your last question there about Brazil specifically, one of the challenges here is that each country is going to have to look very hard at their own emissions profile and their own exposure to future risks related to decarbonisation. It's unlikely that there's a one-size-fits-all answer that all countries will be able to adopt. It's going to very much depend on national circumstance, strategic priorities, and the nature of the tasks that are assigned to militaries by different countries.
Chega ao final essa edição do Poder Entrevista. Em nome do jornal digital Poder 360, eu agradeço ao professor Duncan Depledge.
Thank you so much for having me.
Agradeço também a todos os web espectadores que assistiram a este programa. Essa entrevista foi gravada por videoconferência no estúdio do Poder 360 em Brasília, em 13 de novembro de 2023. Para ficar sempre bem informado, inscreva-se no canal do Poder 360, ative as notificações e não perca nenhuma informação relevante. Muito obrigado e até a próxima!